I'm not sure how smart giving out personal information is after something I thought could only happen in movies actually happened. But I'm scared about what this all could mean, and I want people to hear and know about this if something happens to me. I assure you that I am on no medication, suffer from no mental illnesses, and have no trauma of any kind and anything else that you might think of. I am a completely average person living a completely average life. Well, I was, I guess, up until now. My name is Marielle, and I'm from a small town in Georgia where everybody knows each other, and I work as a 911 operator. My family lives in a rural town out of state, and I haven't spoken to them about this yet out of fear that whatever's going on might somehow affect them too if I get them involved. Yesterday, I began my night shift the same way that I do every evening. Most of the time, I get low-priority calls and a few pranks. And since I've been doing this for a few years now, I've grown quite good at discerning what's an actual concerning call. The shift was rather tame up until I got what I thought was a prank call. 911, what's your emergency? I spoke into the phone after returning my cup of coffee back on the desk and readjusting myself.
Somebody's outside my house. They've been looking around my yard and windows for the past 2 minutes.
It was a woman on the other end. Her voice familiar ever since the first few words, but I couldn't quite place it yet. She spoke very fast, and it was obvious how nervous she was about this. No surprise there, I would be too.
I thought it was some friend, but I don't know this person and they look off.
Okay, ma'am. Nudging my chair closer to the desk as I begin typing on the computer. I asked the lady another question in the meantime. Can you give me your address and tell me if you can see if this person is armed?
Yeah, I'm in the yellow house at...
The woman continued, but I admit I didn't listen. She had just given my house address. I stopped my fingers in the middle of writing and I sighed, thinking that this had to be one of my friends. We're a small bunch and very mischievous towards each other. Sort of out of character for our age, I must admit. But I've said numerous times how serious prank calling 911 can be for people. Who is this? You know how badly this can end for you, right? I reached for my coffee cup, rolling my eyes, and held my hand ready to hang up the call, but she continued.
What? I don't get it. I'm serious, please don't hang up.
She retorted in a tone that caught me off guard. And then again after a second, she returned to the previous somewhat panicked attitude.
I'm sorry, but this isn't a joke. Please, I'm afraid of what this person might do.
Okay, ma'am. I put the cup back on the desk and was ready to prolong this call to enough of an extent to make this woman face the consequences for holding the line. What bad luck for her, I thought, to get the operator living at the exact house she decided would be her target. What's your name and which room are you in right now?
I'm Marielle and I'm looking at my bedroom window right now. They're still there.
My blood started to boil. How senseless this person must be. It was obviously a friend. I raised my voice this time, warning them again about how badly they will regret their actions if they prank call again. And just as I was about to hang up, Marielle started to beg me frantically not to. For whatever reason, something inside me was telling me to listen. I decided to give her one more chance and then I would send the police over to arrest this prank caller and at the very least, give her a slap on the wrist. Okay, Marielle, describe the bedroom to me.
What?
You heard me. What color are the curtains? Is there any furniture, lamps? Tell me what you can see. Though I've known said friends for quite a while now, none of them have ever been in my house. I prefer it that way not because I don't trust them to enter my home, but because I've never been fond of having guests. Neither did my parents when I was little. It's something that they had that is transferred over to me. There's no way that this person would.
Purple curtains, a double bed with a grayish cover with white lines, a wardrobe and a small bedside table with a nightlamp on it.
She went on for a few seconds while I listened, completely dumbfounded. She was describing exactly how my bedroom looked. Her next words snapped me out of the confusion.
Miss, why are you asking me this? There's somebody outside my house.
I couldn't answer her immediately. This was all so surreal. Nothing like anything that I had experienced so far on this job. This woman apparently named Marielle, who sounds just like me, claiming she lives at my address and is standing in the exact same bedroom as mine, was talking to me, Marielle. How did any of this make sense? I tried to keep my cool and continue talking to her normally, but I could hear the shakiness in my own voice when all I could mutter was an "okay, ma'am," before falling silent again, and I rummaged around my desk drawer to find my personal phone. My ex-husband had installed security cameras facing the front, back, and sides of her house at different angles after some people had started talking about the same car driving around their homes multiple times during the day and night, but nothing ever came out of it. It didn't hurt to have the extra security measure, but I never thought that I would actually have to use it. I opened the app while this Marielle kept repeating, "Hello?" but I was too preoccupied to answer. I admit my heart had dropped into my stomach at this point, and it only got worse after I had opened the camera app. My bedroom window looked out on one of the sides of my house, and right beyond the wooden fence was somebody pacing left and right while looking up at the house. I finally snapped back. "Okay, Marielle, okay, I'm sending a patrol car your way immediately. Excuse the holdup." I tried to regain my composure but could still hear my words trembling as I spoke them out loud. While the person wasn't trespassing and technically not committing any crime, what puzzled me more was that I was currently completely free of any alcohol or drug influence, talking to myself, to another me. "Move away from the window to make sure that he doesn't see you. Do you?" I paused for a moment, taking in how ridiculous the whole situation was again, and finished my question, listening intently for the answer that was about to come from the other Marielle, not sure what I was expecting to hear. "Do you have a weapon in your house that you could use in case his intentions become malevolent?"
I mean, the only thing I can think of right now are the knives in the kitchen. And there's an old pistol, but it's in the basement and the door to it is outside. Am I going to have to defend myself?
She sounded stressed out as she asked, but I was more shocked to hear the same exact words that I would have said in response to this question. "I have a pistol and it's in the basement, the door to which is outside." Still unable to comprehend all of this, I told Marielle, or me I guess, to check again to see where the person is, and reassured her that the patrol car is only a few minutes away from the house. Only now did I finally look around, thinking that I must be dreaming, and I caught the gaze of a fellow coworker who had his eyebrow raised. He must have been listening into my conversation and seen me acting off, but I tried to smile to the best of my ability and nod, quickly returning my focus to my screen before I could see his reaction. "Marielle, do you see them still?" I inquired but got no response for another few moments. She then stumbled on her words and I could hear the door creaking open just as my bedroom door did, and her footsteps rapidly moving from room to room, presumably looking out the other windows.
No, he's not out there now. I don't know where he is. Oh God, did I miss him? Is he coming towards my house?"
She sounded like she was on the verge of a panic attack. I did my best trying to calm her down while searching for the person myself, switching between different cameras, and when I found him I saw him in the backyard, with an arm raised in the middle of the air. Moments later, a rock flew towards my kitchen window, and though the cameras have no audio to them, Marielle's shriek was perfectly timed in sync with the impact.
"Holy crap, he just broke one of my windows."
She yelled frantically and began raving inaudibly into the phone. Marielle, get to your attic, quickly. The police will be at your place soon. Use anything you find up there to block the way in." I yelled back, raising my voice loud enough to overshadow hers, and to probably scare my coworkers with the sudden decibel increase. Whatever was happening, it was real. There was someone outside my house who had just broken a window and I was in there, afraid for my life. The advice that I gave her was exactly what I would have done. The attic hatch is in the middle of the hallway leading from the living room to my bedroom, giving her enough time to get up there and block it afterwards, considering this person had to pass through the kitchen and then through the aforementioned parts of the house. By my calculations, Marielle had enough time to get there and use all the pent-up trash and whatever else she could find to hold the hatch shut for the little time left that the police needed to arrive. I could hear Marielle slam the door behind her and run down the laminated hallway towards the hatch. And then I gasped audibly as she yelled into the speaker, and the phone dropped with a loud thud, her footsteps becoming more and more distant as another heavier set made their way faster and faster through the hallway and closer to the phone. "Are you still there? The police are almost at your location," was all that I could think to say in my last effort to scare whoever this person was away. A few seconds of silence, and I expected to hear something, anything. Some scary or cryptid remark, or at least breathing. But there was nothing. My last word into the receiver was an empty hello before the other end hung up. I couldn't believe what had just happened, and I must have sat at my desk, staring into the screen for at least 2 minutes before the same coworker from before, Connor, came and put his hand on my shoulder, prompting me to scream and push him away. The entire office looked our way and he put his hands up in the air. I apologized profusely more times than I could count. Everyone turned back to their desks, then Connor lowered his hands. "Tough call?" he asked and leaned to my desk, handed me a chocolate bar. "You seemed really on edge the entire time, and well, this just confirms it." I didn't even acknowledge the snack after I looked at it and just met his eyes again, not knowing what to say. I began with a few disconnected words before excusing myself and leaving the shift early. It's a little after 2:30 as I finish writing this. I booked myself a room into the most crowded hotel that I could find, with the room closest to the stairs leading to the reception, shutting the blinds and locking the door twice. I'm afraid to go home, and I don't know who to talk to about this without sounding completely insane. I've heard nothing from the responding police officers yet, and I don't know what to do about this tomorrow. Anybody reading this or listening, please believe me, and even if you don't, can you please offer me some advice? I just woke up and it's 4:16. 5 minutes ago, 2 calls from somebody with no caller ID woke me up, but I didn't pick up. I'm afraid for my safety. I sat in the cushioned armchair in the hotel room that Marielle had rented after running off inexplicably from her shift last night. I called earlier this morning after finishing work without even going to sleep. She's always been level-headed, and her acting like this made me feel concerned. I couldn't just let her go, and now here I was, listening to how she apparently spoke to herself last night on the phone. "Marielle, are you sure these night shifts aren't a bit too much for you?" Though I wanted to trust her, what she was describing to me sounded straight out of a book or a movie, and the lack of sleep really takes a toll too big for you to even comprehend. I'm not saying you're making this up, but maybe just you remembered it wrong. Marielle paced around the room with one hand resting on her hip and the other held up to her forehead, pushing her hair back, and she exhaled loudly. "I know this sounds insane, Connor, but I'm telling you, I'm 100% certain about what I heard and saw on those cameras. There was another me in that house last night, and some person broke my window. How can you be taking this so calmly? We haven't even heard from the responders yet, and it's been more than 6 hours." She was right. There had been no info back to us on that call, nothing on the news, no contact from the officers. When I used Marielle's phone to try and call back whoever it was that woke her up, there was nothing. I told her that while I can't explain the call itself, I agreed that it was too dangerous for her to go back home, considering that there was an intruder. I offered her to stay at my place for the next few days, and while she agreed and thanked me, she wouldn't let the topic of her other self go. I understood her to some extent, but I was still skeptical. And so I offered her to go back to my place so that I could change and grab the pistol that I kept locked in my safe and a flashlight, and then we could go and look for the officers at her house ourselves. She was afraid, but I think the curiosity and stress about what might have happened to the supposed other her prevailed, and was what had made her agree to this plan. I waited for her to get her things out of the room and I drove back to my house, in the meantime asking her about any details she might have missed about the call to make sure that we were going in prepared. The drive to her house wasn't long, and during it, I tried to play some music to lighten the mood or talk to her about anything that I could to distract her, but all I got was 1 or 2 words in response, while she was lost in thought looking out the window. When we arrived, I parked in her driveway where, just outside, sat the policeman's car, with the 2 front doors slightly ajar but no sign of them. Mario's breathing fastened and I put a hand on her shoulder to calm her down, and then without anything being said between the both of us, we got out of the car. The first thing we did was walk up to the police car and see if there was anything out of the ordinary, like slashed tires or any signs of a struggle. But it was parked there like any other vehicle and there was nothing obvious on the inside. What I discovered though was the radio, which while it didn't look like it had been tampered with, was not working. I walked back towards the house and called for Marielle to walk with me as we circled it from afar, finding the broken window leading into the kitchen. I was just about to suggest calling 911 again and have them go into the house while we wait outside, but Marielle snapped before I could even begin to speak. "Why is nothing being done about this?" She raised her hands in the air and turned to look at me, her blue eyes conveying a mixture of anger and confusion. 2 policemen have disappeared since responding to this call. There was an intruder in my home and there was literally a clone or something of me inside while I was at work. Tell me why we haven't heard anything about this, Connor. I don't know, okay? If anything happened like you say it did, it just doesn't make sense. I cut her off before she started talking again, knowing that she would jump me for accusing her of lying. But we really should let the authorities handle this. We're not professionals. Marielle tried to get something out, but just cut herself off and shook her head. I thought that she had given in and would do the logical thing and take my advice. Instead, she turned and walked a few steps towards her back door and then looked back at me. "What are you doing?" "I'm going in. No one's gonna listen to me anyway, and I'm not about to leave here without at least some kind of answer or clue." I stared at her, completely taken aback, and I waited a few seconds to see if she would say anything else, but she just stayed there looking right at me. I knew deep down she was hoping that I would say that I'm going in with her. Well, before I did that, I tried to convince her to think this through again, but that was obviously not going to work. So that's just what I did, but I have to admit I was getting nervous myself. The back door was unlocked and led into a different hallway than the one that she had told me about, which I figured out by the lack of an attic hatch. Marielle told me the layout of her home and we walked together, me in front and with my gun drawn as I called out asking if anybody was there. She smacked my shoulder and raised her arms with wide eyes and I shushed her. We had no way of knowing if there was an intruder or police officers, or both, and I didn't want blood on my hands, no matter whose. As you might expect, we got no response from anywhere and heard nothing that might indicate that there was anybody else in there with us. We found nothing out of the ordinary in the rooms of Marielle's home, but the hallway with the attic had some things worth noting. The first being what we immediately saw: the phone on the ground, and slight marks like scratches on the walls which were the only signs of anything out of the ordinary. Well, besides the broken window. "That must be what she used to call. It's identical to mine." She grabbed it and tried turning it on, but it had no battery left. The screen was slightly cracked at the top right edge, probably where it had first impacted the floor. "What is going on, Connor?" "Calm down," I began, knowing that she wouldn't listen. "There's only the attic and the basement left for us to look through. We can check up there and then go down last. How's that sound?" "Yeah, okay, but the basement's locked. If the key hasn't been moved, it must be in one of my bedroom drawers." "All right, I'll check out the attic while you go get the key. There's no point in both of us going up there." I raised the gun in the air while reaching for my flashlight. "Don't worry about me." Marielle nodded and began walking towards the bedroom, disappearing past the door after I had started ascending into the attic. There was nothing on top of the hatch, which I realized before even looking around to see because of how easily I was able to lift it open, confirming our suspicions that the other woman hadn't made it up there before the end of the call. What immediately struck me as odd was the immediate drop in temperature here. I mean, yeah, it was an attic, but the difference must have been at least 10 degrees, and I shivered as I made my way up and started shining the light across the entire space. Behind empty old boxes, worn-out furniture, and the various other items not worth noting, there was no place for anyone to hide up here, or at least, not if you ask me, because I looked through every nook and cranny there was and found no traces of anyone or anything. Walking back, I started descending the ladder and called for Marielle, but I got no response. I wasn't immediately concerned because the hatch was left open, and if anything had happened, I would have heard it. Waiting for a few seconds and remaining without a response, I made my way towards the bedroom, which was just as empty as when we looked in there together earlier. I called out for her again and started looking through each of the rooms, and while doing that, I paused for a moment to listen, but not for Marielle. The background noises from earlier, like birds or passing cars, had all stopped. Again, that didn't strike me as odd at that moment. Looking through the rest of the rooms proved fruitless, and I thought that maybe she had gone outside, probably waiting for me by the basement. And so I made my way to the back door and I opened it. It led me back into the living room. I blinked and looked behind me. I was certainly in the same corridor that we were first in when entering the house. Despite that, I shut the door and turned back to exit from the front of the house. And when I opened that one, I was greeted with the kitchen. I just stood there for a few seconds, unable to take in what was happening, and I rubbed my eyes, but here I was, still inside the house, standing right at the front door, which was leading me back inside. I walked through and approached the window that was broken by the intruder. Instead of the green yard, the street with parked cars and neighboring houses, I was greeted by a view into the bedroom. My heart started pounding, and I admit that I was on the verge of a panic attack. I started sweating profusely, and my heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest as I began running from room to room, door through door, trying to get out and again finding myself in different parts of the house. I had to stop and sit down for a few moments before I would pass out, and while regaining my composure, I saw something odd. Not that this whole situation wasn't far more disturbing than I'm giving it credit for. I noticed that the walls of the living room where I was currently sitting had changed color, and half the table was just missing. Like, imagine a bug or a glitch in some video game where half a piece of furniture is there and the rest is gone. The table still had two of its legs on which it was standing completely fine, but the surface was cut diagonally and the rest of it just wasn't even there. I waved my hand through where it was supposed to be and they just swiped right through the air. I continued walking through different rooms and the changes began getting more and more apparent. Like the chandelier in the kitchen was upside down and sitting in the middle of the air attached to nothing. It was physically there, and when I tried pushing it, it wouldn't move, but I could feel and touch it. I don't know how long I spent in this place, but for the first time in what was now feeling like hours, I heard a noise. Breathing. Rapid, scared breathing just like mine when I found myself here. It was coming from the neighboring room. I couldn't say which one, as by now it had been a gamble where I would stumble at. I ended up appearing back into the bedroom where I was greeted by a gruesome sight of a tall man with torn clothing and wounds, superficial and deep all over his body, lying in a messy pool of red and something dark mixed with it, some of which was splattered on the wall behind him, where I saw the same scratch marks as the ones on the walls of the hallway before. It was as if I had an instantaneous flashback after seeing him. What remained of his clothing was the same as what the person who broke into Marielle's home was wearing. He was still alive, but his eyes were red and he screamed as he saw me. I did the same in reaction. No, 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 get away from me. He yelled through pained inhales and tried to muster up strength to throw one of his shoes at me, but it only got over his leg and was barely any further away from him. Get away! I'm not going to hurt you. Look, You're not real. Taking the risk of giving him a heart attack that would finally take him out of his misery, I rushed by his side and held my hands in the air, yelling loud enough to silence him. I started shooting every question that I could think of at him, and when he stopped trying to talk over me, I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. He looked as if he was about to faint any moment now, and I asked him what this place was, why he broke in, if he knows Marielle, and I could barely get any coherent response out of him until he grabbed my right arm with a strength that he didn't look like he had, which left me shocked and silent. During my time of silence, he spoke. Not people. Fake. Before I could inquire, he could reveal more himself. I was suddenly thrown into the wall next to the man. I couldn't even yell in reaction to the pain. Another blow struck me right in the ribs, and the pain was so unexpected and strong that I held my eyes shut and clutched at my sides. Amidst the chaos, I could hear the man scream, and suddenly what I assume happened was that he got thrown away. His screams continued but faded in the distance, and I heard a crash and glass breaking. Mere moments later, just as I was about to open my eyes, I was grabbed by one of my arms and flung right back out of the room's door. Suddenly, all the noise stopped, and I stayed curled in a ball on the floor, tears of pain streaming down my cheeks as I held my hands over where I had been kicked or punched or whatever happened. I assumed that I had at least 2 broken ribs, and I could barely touch the area without sharp pain coming in. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the attic, but this time I could hear Marielle yelling for me downstairs. I slowly got myself back up, holding my side while descending back down into the corridor. I could hear that the neighborhood sounds had returned. I'm here, I shouted and sat on the floor while waiting for her to arrive. When she did, she gasped and ran at me, putting a hand on my shoulder, asking me what had happened and how I got hurt. We have to get out of here. She helped me get up, allowing me to lean over on her as we started walking out. I'll explain it at the hotel. I allowed her to drive, and she kept asking me questions in the meantime, but I was too exhausted and in pain to respond coherently. We arrived at the parking lot, and she turned to face me, looking me in the eyes and saying something that I didn't even register at that point. I was too caught up in a small detail that I knew that I would have noticed for all the time that I've known her. Marielle, since when are your eyes 2 different colors? I couldn't find the key to the basement no matter where I looked in the bedroom. I don't remember misplacing it, but with everything that's happened in the past 12 or so hours, I wasn't about to question something as mundane as this. Afraid to go too far without Connor, I decided to wait by the ladder up to the attic for him to finish searching, and maybe join him if he found something. But when I stopped to listen, I could hear no footsteps or any noise coming from up there. Connor? I called while looking up at the darkness above me. Seeing no ray of light from his flashlight either, but I heard him speak to me and figured that he must be quite a way inside. I'm up here. His voice was flat and it just sounded strange and not quite like him, but I choked it up to the way that sound carried itself from above to the hallway. Come up. I found something. What's up? I asked, starting to climb the ladder but didn't get the answer that I expected. Actually, I got no answer at all. Connor? I called again with my head now poking up into the attic, and I finished descending. I cleaned my hands of the dust and shivered from how cold it was up here, and then I looked around and found myself completely in the dark, with no light coming from anywhere. Something felt wrong, and I wasn't sure if the next chill that ran through my body was from the cold or my intuition. I didn't wait around to find out and quickly climbed back down into the hallway where the cold of the attic followed me. It was strange to say the least. It wasn't like that before when I had gone up there. I waited for a little while wondering what had caused Connor to behave so unlike himself. The cold was too much and I began feeling uncomfortable. So while waiting for him, I decided that I would go back into the bedroom to grab a jacket. But upon opening the door, I was greeted to my living room. I don't think that I need to describe to you how I felt at that moment, but I began growing more and more concerned as I wandered from room to room and found myself in an impossible loop of my own home, to which I was now like a mouse to a trap. Occasionally, after going through each room so many times, I could hear sounds that didn't seem to fit, and objects denying reality itself. Windows had been placed on ceilings looking into nothing, furniture floating in the middle of the air or clipping into the floor, a reality show playing in the middle of my kitchen in which there was no TV. To say the least, I was terrified and convinced that I would never make it out of here, as everything only seemed to get worse and only that much more confusing. And no matter how much time I spent looking in each room, I would move to the next and I would find nothing that even hinted at a way of getting out of this maze. Adrenaline flooded my body in the middle of my search of the kitchen when I heard footsteps and increasingly louder static mixed with a voice constantly changing its pitch, but not in a regular way. Rather, this voice was constantly swapping between male and female. There was nowhere in the kitchen to hide, so the only thing that I could do was hide behind the counter on the other side and stay as silent as I could be, considering the circumstances. I covered my mouth and still feared the sound of my heart pounding would be enough to give me away. The three sounds moved closer and closer together and eventually reached the kitchen. The footsteps came to a stop, but what I was hearing disturbed me in a way that nothing had been able to in all my time alive. What I heard, presumably coming from the entrance to the kitchen, was like I said, a voice swapping between that of a man and a woman, mixed in with radio static, citing yesterday's news and then the weather report, random conversations and then something all too familiar.
911, what's your emergency?
It was my voice. My breathing froze and I slowly looked up without revealing myself from the counter, expecting whatever was here in the kitchen with me to be looking down like in a horror movie, but thankfully there was nothing. The voice continued as swapping between the voices of two other men, mine and out of nowhere, Connor's.
Marielle, since when are your eyes two different colors?
I widened my eyes in disbelief and covered my mouth with both hands, praying whatever this was would leave. The static grew louder first and then it began stopping and starting again at random intervals, while this thing continued repeating the same phrase over and over again. It was sickening to listen to.
Marielle, since when are your eyes two different colors?
By now the voices had stopped swapping and only Connor's was the one repeating this. And then just as suddenly as it arrived, the footsteps began walking in the opposite direction, and the phrase fading into the otherwise silent house. I was so petrified by what had just happened that I couldn't bring myself to get up for another few minutes, and I had to keep myself from crying. After spending enough time with just myself and no inexplicable sounds showing up, I stood upright again and looked around to find that I was alone. It finally dawned on me that because of the state of panic that I was in, I had completely forgotten the most obvious part of the kitchen, the window that the intruder broke to get inside. It was still shattered, but unlike most of the other windows that looked into nothing or just walls, beyond it was my bedroom and the sight of a body on the ground that I couldn't recognize. I yelped when I saw it, and then noticed that it was lying in a pool of red. I crawled through the window and approached it slowly. Being able to get closer to it allowed me to see that its clothes, though torn and bloody, were the same as the ones the man who had broken my window was wearing. The realization made me stop in my tracks for a moment before resuming my crawl towards them. It was a man whose face I could not see. It was turned away from me and the hood of the gray hoodie, or what remained of it, was still up. There must have been some kind of fight with someone or something, because over his legs was my bedside table, with the lamp broken on the ground and glass scattered all around. Carefully kneeling down as to not cut myself, I turned the man's head towards me, revealing the wide-eyed, bloody face of somebody that I knew all too well. Lying before me dead on the ground after breaking into my home was my ex-husband, Russell. I never talked about Russell much to anyone after we had finalized our divorce. I had long since been emotionally detached from him after 2 years of growing neglect that made us argue more and more every day, and we would end up not talking to each other for weeks after some of the fights. Everything started as what I first thought was a way for him to try and scare me, as he knew that I had always been afraid of anything horror related. So he found it funny to occasionally read out a scary story or pop out of a corner to see my reaction. I never paid him much mind and only laughed it off when he started talking about the other side and the mirror people. But he kept getting more and more interested in it until that was everything that he would talk about from day to night, sometimes not even sleeping to continue what he called his research, and what I found to be mindless scrolling on the internet and reading made-up articles about some made-up thing to scare teenagers and gullible minds. Now, after everything that I had seen and gone through, I remembered all of it for the first time in a few months, after I had been able to bury it in my mind. I don't know what he was doing here, why he was trying to break into my home, and how he ended up like this. So many thoughts flooded through my head instantly, most of them grief and confusion, but I had no time to process any of them as I jumped back at the sight, and a piece of glass pierced through my right palm and I let out an involuntary yelp. Just as I did that, I immediately heard the same sounds from earlier, footsteps and voices with static mixed in, repeating random words and phrases. But this time there was more than one, and they were coming right towards me. I turned to my bed and I rushed to hide under it, having no time to get to the wardrobe or try and make my way back through the window and into the kitchen. The covers were hanging loosely and covered half the space below the bed, so if I stayed quiet, I would have a chance to go unnoticed. The unearthly sights kept coming. Rushing into the bedroom were 3 men, 2 in police uniforms whose movements were unnaturally stiff and their faces expressionless, their eyes not even moving. And the third was not Connor. I mean, it looked like him, it had his face, but his expression was constantly changing, from a smile to nothing to a grimace to sadness, to every single emotion that you could think of. His clothes were the ones that I had seen him in when he changed after he went to his house, only their colors were changing rapidly. And then in the blink of an eye he was wearing a suit, again the colors changing and mixing. What terrified me the most about the view was his limbs. Like I mentioned, the policemen were totally stiff and unmoving, but this Connor's look-alike limbs were spasming and flying around in movements the human body simply couldn't perform. One moment his arm was by his side and the next it was raised backwards 90 degrees, instantly afterwards pointing forward and then clipping into his body before returning to normal again, and his head snapped violently from side to side, as if his neck were constantly breaking and repairing itself. Their presence brought with them the static, but once they had entered the room, the voices had stopped, and they just sat there for about half a minute before the static began ringing so loud that I almost had to cover my ears, and then the 3 just disappeared. They were gone as if they had never been there. I waited to see if anything would return again or if I would hear any noises, but the only thing was total silence and the body of my ex-husband uncomfortably close to me while I was hiding. I crawled out from under the bed and took one more look at him before quickly jumping through the window and into the kitchen again. Only this time it led me back into the hallway with the attic. There was sure to be emotional fallout from this, but my brain was not letting me process it now. Before I could even look around, I was tackled by something into the wall and my mouth was covered, preventing me from screaming no matter how I tried. I started throwing my hands erratically into this thing, trying to hit it and make it release me, but it only began shushing me and reduced the strength of its grip. I opened my eyes to see Connor, bruised and disheveled, his clothes dirty and stained with blood. He stared at me and spoke. "Blue eyes," and then licked at my bloody hand and let me go. Before that, pressing a finger to his lips, telling me to stay silent. Seeing him so beat up while the rest of those things looked, well, completely abnormal and impossible to even exist, and considering the fact that he was not the actual Connor and wanted to harm me, it had the opportunity to but didn't. "Connor?" I whispered and eyed him up and down. He really had it rough somewhere. "Is it you, the real you?" Yes, quiet. "Marielle, something's here and it's not human." Connor was more afraid than I had ever seen him, and he gave the impression of somebody who was not easy to scare. "We need to find a way out." "How did you end up here, from the attic?" "Yeah, the first time." "The first time?" After making sure we heard none of those things approaching and looked through the window in each of the doors, Connor and I sat in the middle of the hallway where he explained to me how he had been attacked by something after finding the intruder, and was thrown back into what we assume was reality, where I found him and we drove back to the hotel. That's where he had seen that my eyes were different colors, and bringing it up caused this other Marielle to begin distorting her limbs, and just like I had seen the other Connor do, and her head had started to twitch. Before he could get out of the car, she lunged at him from the driver's seat, and he woke up again in the middle of the living room. We were able to mutually shock each other, him with his experience and me with the fact that this intruder was my ex-husband. "So why did he break into your home? Does he hate you or did he want to hurt you?" No, it was obvious to me that he still loved me even after all the arguments and the divorce. I was the one that ended things. But he had spoken about the other side and the mirror people. That's what he called them. I blinked and moved my eyes from staring into the wall that was not the right color to look at Connor. I think that he knew something about this and he was trying to warn me. We sat in thought for a little while longer before he got up and helped me off the floor. "We have to find a way out fast, Marielle." The door we went through led us into my bathroom, or this place's version of it. It looked exactly like it normally does, which was unusual aside from one thing, and that was the mirror, which did not have its usual reflective surface, but it was instead looking into another bathroom. We looked around thoroughly first before I helped Connor climb up the sink and he crawled through. The second he did, however, he disappeared and I was left all alone again, afraid to turn back and unsure of what else to do. I started making my way onto the sink with one leg and through the mirror with the rest of my body. Halfway through, I turned in reaction to hearing an ear-piercing scream coming from a woman mixed with the undertone of a male voice and that static. Charging through the door of the bathroom and right at me was me. The other Marielle's eyes were wide and her mouth open as loud as it could humanly go, and she grabbed me by my ankle and began pulling me back in. I held on to the edges and screamed, using my other leg to kick at her hands, but she wouldn't let go, only intensifying these inhuman screams that will forever haunt my nightmares. Despite that, I continued trying while looking around to see if there was anything on the sink that might help me, and I saw the glass cup that I used to keep my toothbrush in. I grabbed it and used all my strength to slam it into the other Marielle's head, shattering it. A final kick into her face was enough to force her to release me, and I made the rest of my way into the mirror, her screams stopping as if I had just woken up from a dream. I dropped down onto the floor with a loud thud, immediately pushing myself back up against the wall and hyperventilating while Connor looked at me unsure of what to do. "Hey, what the heck happened? Why did it take you so long?" He knelt by my side and winced in pain, putting his left hand over his ribs. "Well, the other me dang near dragged me back in." "Holy, well, you don't have to worry about that, I think. Look." Connor pointed to the mirror after my breathing slowly started to go back to normal, and I only saw pitch black in it. "Looks like we found the way out." "How do you know that we're out?" "Listen, there's noises outside. You hear those construction workers, the cars." I nodded and took in the sounds that he was describing. I don't know if you noticed, but there's none of that in there. I stood up and approached it. not daring to put my hand through but stared into the black void. I would describe what I was seeing as impossible, but considering everything that had gone down just now, I don't think that word has any meaning anymore. We need to get out of this house before we get trapped again. Is your car still outside? I asked as I opened the door leading out into the hallway, making sure to check beforehand. The house looked completely normal. No, I don't know where it is. Maybe still at the hotel, or honestly, I have no idea. I just showed up here again after being attacked by whatever that thing pretending to be you was. My car was at the hotel also, at least that's where I left it after ending my shift early following that call. So we decided to call a taxi to get us to Connor's house where we could both take a break and get fixed up, hopefully without having to worry about being pulled into another dimension or whatever the place that we were trapped in was. After I took a shower, Connor went to rest and he made sure that he had no wounds that he was missing. I had wrapped my hand in bandages before using his laptop, with his permission of course, to do some research on what Russell had been so obsessed with all that time ago. The weight of finding the man that I had spent so much time in love with dead in a place that couldn't exist still hadn't come down on me, but at least it allowed me to remain focused. Looking up Mirror People and The Other Side together yielded scattered and terribly written posts with grammar and spelling mistakes, packed with action scenes that were obviously works of fiction by people who had stumbled upon something similar online. But one of the top results was an actually well put together website describing these entities as another me, documenting reports of people seeing and hearing, talking and even interacting with themselves. But by the time it had reached that point, no more updates had been posted. I showed the website to Connor and he browsed through it, finding something that I hadn't looked for yet at the bottom corner of the page. It was the creator of the website's name, a middle-aged woman by the name of Rebecca Simmons, and contact information about her email, encouraging people who have an experience to share to contact her. We have nothing to lose, right? I mean, this all sounds completely insane and psychotic, but we just went through it. And this woman is probably the only person ready to believe us right off the bat. Connor looked at me again, but suddenly his eyes trailed towards my injured hand. Sure. Are you going to write that email or should I? Connor didn't reply and he seemed zoned out. What's wrong? Marielle, what's happening to your hand? I looked at my injured hand and gasped, and then quickly lifted up the leg of my pants to see the same thing on my ankle. At the same time, Connor lifted one side of his shirt enough to see where he had been attacked. My hand, ankle, and that part of Connor's torso were pitch black. An excruciatingly long day full of fear and anxiety passed before we heard back from Rebecca. She had messaged us asking to meet in person after we had described our situation in detail, but warned us in advance that she does not know how helpful she would be. The drive to the address that she had given us was about an hour and a half away in Augusta, where she had a small apartment that she was staying at currently. Connor and I walked to the hotel to find my car still there, but his had disappeared. We kept a close eye on our wounds and bruises, unsure of what they actually were, and if they could spread. We were relieved to see that they still hadn't. I would like to say we discussed theories and possible reasons for why this was happening, and why to us, but we were so afraid and exhausted by now that we barely said anything to each other. I had spoken to my family on the phone earlier and had to pretend that everything was okay, when deep down I wanted to cry into the receiver to my mother and ask her what to do. Anything we tried to find regarding the missing police officers who responded to the call that night online was met with old articles that coincidentally had some of the same keywords that I had used in my search. There was nothing on the news either. It was as if nothing had happened at all. We arrived in Augusta a little after noon and turned from the main street to town into another narrow road that led to Rebecca's neighborhood. We climbed up to the third floor and rang her bell. Footsteps approaching the door a few moments later and stopping, presumably looking through the large peephole before she opened the door to greet us. What we saw in person was a woman slightly older than the one on the website, so I assumed the photo must have been taken some years ago. Good afternoon, I assume that you're Mary Ellen Connor. She pushed the door open fully now and looked at me first and then at him. Yes, thank you for having us, Miss Simmons. We're not sure who we can even turn to about this. Connor nodded and then brought his head down slightly as if admitting defeat. Nobody, I hate to tell you. You're not the first to come to me about something like this, but you're probably the only ones to have. She seemed hesitant to finish her sentence but did so after a brief pause. Survived. Connor and I turned to meet our eyes and Rebecca invited us in, apologizing for saying what she did and shut the door behind us once we had entered. She went to make us coffee while we took our shoes and jackets off and made ourselves comfortable in her living room, and I tried taking some of the stress off by petting her puppy, a French bulldog that couldn't have been older than a few months. They allow pets in the building. I tried initiating small talk when she came back to set a friendlier tone before we got to what we were really here for. Now you can say that. Honestly, the owner is against animals of any kind in the apartments, but I convinced him how little trouble he would cause and that if he broke or damaged anything, I would pay back in full. Isn't that right, Frankie? In response, Frankie mustered up a half bark and licked her hand as she went to pet his head, and then sat down on the opposite side of the sofa that me and Connor were on a small cushioned chair. I know who you are, Marielle. I must admit that phrase almost sent me into fight or flight considering that I'd been on edge to say the least for the past little over 2 days, and I was ready to jump up and run out of that apartment. But she continued just in time to allow me to prevent myself from doing so. Your husband contacted me a year ago trying to find out more about the mirror world and the creatures living in it. I'm sorry to hear what happened and that you had to relive it, writing it in the email. Her mentioning my ex-husband's death was a gut punch, as I still hadn't even started processing it over the weight of everything that's happened, and I stared blankly at her. Connor noticed and took over the conversation for me. Did he mention anything that we might need to know? Why he was trying to break into Mariella's home? Rebecca took a sip from her coffee, which still had steam coming off of it, and switched her gaze to me, picking up Frankie off the floor once he had jumped off as soon as I stopped petting him, obviously completely disinterested in me now, and set him on her lap. Because he was afraid of exactly what's happening to you. I can't put this any other way, so I'll be forward about it. Russell did not seem exactly in his right mind even back then. He was talking about all kinds of theories and supposed discoveries that he had made that sounded like the ravings of a madman. But what was evident to me was his duty to protect you from it. I assume that's why he was there that night, but he was unlucky enough to encounter something that only appeared to be you. Both Connor and I were at a loss for words at how casually this woman seemed to be talking about this, as if it was an everyday occurrence that some body snatchers who apparently lived in your mirror or something like that took over your life and pretended to be you. But that didn't stop her from continuing. Admittedly, though, he was one of the few to have actually come to me with more than just claims of there being another version of them. So what are these things, and why are they targeting us? Connor said, not having even touched his coffee yet. Not that I did either. I don't know for sure how they choose their hosts, as I call them, but from what Russell and others before and after him have told me is that they form when you feel lost for an extended period of time in your life, like a piece of you seems to be missing. Is that description accurate for you after your divorce, Marielle? Part of me was getting more and more furious at how confidently this woman was trying to gouge the low points in my life, but I couldn't bring myself to go against her when everything she had been saying so far was correct. And it didn't help that she sounded so confident. Well, maybe it did. Because we were finally talking to someone who not only believed us, but seemed experienced in the topic at hand. It does. And I guess the same goes for Russell. He started talking about all of this a month after his father had passed in a tragic work accident. I thought that he was taking the loss really bad, but my God. I took a moment to think everything through and allowed myself to finally take a sip from the coffee that Rebecca had made before continuing. You said that he had made some kind of discovery when he had come to you. What were you talking about? Well, I don't know if your husband had ever come in contact with any of them, but according to him, the only way to sever these beings' connection to you was to destroy them in their own world. I'll be honest that I was up until very recently skeptical about its existence as a whole, considering no one had ever actually been to it, or at least done that and returned to tell the tale. But here you two are, and you have evidence. She held her hand up to her ribcage while also looking at my ankle, referring to the dark marks that Connor and I had. I'm sure that he felt as unnerved as I did at the mention of them. And what do these markings mean? Do you know? Connor joined in. My theory is that it's this other reality's way to manifest itself into our own. I can't tell you what that means or how dangerous it may be, but I hope that nobody has to find out. She put Frankie back on the ground and he tried to get her attention again by scratching on her left leg for a second, before making a sound like an angry toddler and curling up by her feet. And then Rebecca leaned on her knees and her eyes darted from Connor's to mine and back. I know that this will sound like a death wish, but you were already there once. You twice even, Connor. And you both managed to escape. In all my time following this phenomenon, I've not heard or met anyone who's done that. I would say that it's your decision if you wanted to do this, but with those marks that you have, I'm not sure if you have any choice in the matter if you want to stay. You must go back and destroy your imposters before they claim you. I don't have to explain how hard my stomach dropped as we were literally instructed to go back into that maze that took the form of my home. But at the same time, there was no other solution that we could think of. And I'm sure that it had been floating around Connor's head as much as it had been in mine recently. But how do we even go about doing it? We don't know what they even are. How are we supposed to fight them? My voice trembled at the mention of a confrontation with them. We don't call them mirror people just because we came up with it randomly, Marielle. We came out of that world through your mirror. You see how they're trying to become you slowly. So, Rebecca stood up and walked over to one of the walls of the apartment that had a large rectangular mirror on it. My guess is that attacking them with glass will be effective in hurting and potentially killing them. Your guess? Connor stood up and I felt the disbelief in his words as if they were my own. You're telling us to enter whatever that place is again, most likely walking straight to our death or God knows, maybe something even worse. And all you have to go off of is your guess. She turned back to face him, seemingly unaffected by his demeanor, and crossed her arms before speaking. Like I said, I've never encountered one of them myself, and I'm only going off of what I've heard by people that I've spoken to both in person and through my forum. If it makes you feel better, I'm more than willing to come with you. I've been investigating this far too long, and I want to be able to help others in your situation, if they ever come to find me. So you're saying this isn't just happening to me, it's a whole phenomenon. When was the first time something like this happened? I can't tell you for sure, Marielle. Rebecca shrugged and now turned her whole body to face us, and Connor shook his head while sitting down but remained silent. But you are not the only one being haunted by yourself. You might realize now, though, why it's not a widespread threat. People who look for help from those not familiar with it end up ostracized or thrown into mental hospitals. We stayed at Rebecca's apartment for another half an hour, going through Connor's and my experience in the mirror world and then getting ready to leave and drive back to my house. It sounds just as insane as it did then typing this out. Our conversation on the drive back with Connor in the driver's seat this time was mostly filler or silence. As much as I didn't want to admit it because she was still helping us, Rebecca was not a great person to be around, and I can see why she'd been doing something so out of the ordinary considering how apathetic she seemed to people's emotions. And the second thing that I was looking forward to the most after freeing myself of the other me's torment was not having to spend another second with her. After she gave us some more information and theories about what we have to do, we came to the conclusion that we had to get rid of mine and Connor's double in order to sever our link to this other reality or dimension. We decided that we would do our best to destroy those of the two policemen who disappeared in response to the call if we found them. And I'm sorry if this makes me sound like a bad person, but I was not ready to spend more time in that place while trying to save someone that I didn't know, and I just wanted it to be over already. And I think Rebecca was the only one who, despite all her supposed experience, failed to realize that we were literally about to enter another dimension to fight beings that were nothing close to humans, when she urged us to make it our goal to find them as well. Arriving at my driveway was just as chilling as before, the eeriness amplified by the police car still outside. On our way, we had passed by a store to buy a medium-sized mirror that we broke in order to arm ourselves with shards of its glass, an idea suggested by Rebecca that I was not sure how it made me feel when you take into account the superstitions around the bad luck that will follow you when you break a mirror. She seemed to not care and was more than happy to shatter it without a second thought. Of course, getting herself the longest and sharpest piece she could find and leaving us with the shorter ones. We explained to Rebecca that going up into the attic was what sent both Connor and I into the other world, and he was the first to go up the ladder, then Rebecca, and finally myself. All three of us commented on the sudden chill and cold of the attic and then slowly descended back into the hallway to find nothing out of the ordinary until the first time a room repeated. But what was stranger than usual was how the distortions appeared almost instantaneously, with floating or half-missing furniture, misplaced windows, and the like. I can't believe I'm actually seeing this myself. For a change, this time Rebecca sounded like the one completely lost in the situation. I don't know about Connor, but it made me feel more in control, like I knew what to expect. Of course, I didn't. Okay, listen to me. I tried to sound as confident as I could to grab their attention. I have an idea. We can walk all we want and expect to find one of those things, or we can draw them to us. While I was here, when I made a noise, they came almost instantly. So let's devise a plan. I looked around the room that we were currently in. It was the kitchen, a perfect place for an ambush. I would stay behind the counter by the window looking towards the doorway, on either side of which Connor and Rebecca would wait with glass shards in hand to stab them into whichever creature came first. They agreed to the plan and took their positions while I looked into one of the shelves floating in the middle of the air, instead of which were small glass cups, not behind on defying the laws of physics. Looking back at the others and raising the cup in the air, they nodded in approval and I took a deep breath and braced myself, squeezing my shard in the other hand. Before I dropped the glass, I looked at the mark on my hand, which seemed to have grown to almost consuming my entire palm. We had to get this done, or who knows what would follow us. I simulated a pained yell as I threw the glass onto the ground, and seconds later, the all too familiar static and distant voices started storming towards the kitchen from the other room. Turning the corner was a man in a police uniform. I assume one of the two that were unlucky enough to be sent as the responders the night that I got the call. It took all the strength in me not to flinch as its what were up until now stiff movements turned into a feral sprint accompanied by a reverberating inhuman growl. The moment that thing appeared through the doorway, Connor and Rebecca were swift to stab their shards into its body. Connor managed to slice into its abdomen while Rebecca jammed hers straight into its right eye. Moments later, the awful sound it somehow produced was cut like a TV turning off, and it began crackling until eventually shattering into pieces that littered the floor. The three of us looked at each other in disbelief. We had just killed one of those things, and without it even being able to reach us. For the first time, I felt strong, triumphant, like I was going to be the one that they should be afraid of. Well, that was short-lived. The only form of celebration that we were able to have was momentary looks of widened eyes and smiles before the sounds returned. The footsteps, the screaming, the static. So many sets of footsteps, so much static. Rebecca yelped and Connor held his free hand up to his ear and shut his eyes tight while I backed away from the counter. In that moment of fear, I forgot about the broken window. Before I could see what was about to come through the door, I was pulled back by my hair so hard that for a second I thought my scalp was about to rip. I could only keep myself on my feet for less than 2 seconds, calling out for help before my spine slammed against the bottom of the window frame. and I went limp just long enough to be pulled into the bedroom it was looking into and thrown across half its length, rolling across the floor. I could hear the commotion in the kitchen the whole time. Rebecca screamed while Connor was silent, but I could hear objects being thrown into the walls and an occasional grunt that I assumed came from him. I did my best to stand up as quickly as possible, and that's when I realized my glass shard was gone. Likely I had dropped it when I was grabbed. I opened my eyes to instantly be met with the sight of the other Marielle standing a few feet away from me with her mouth opened impossibly, revealing her entire bottom row of teeth but no tongue. And her eyes were 2 different colors, just like Connor had told me. She produced the same horrifying scream, but it wasn't mixed with any static. It sounded exactly like me, but as if I was being brutally torn apart, like I was being tortured in the most awful of ways possible. Looking around the bedroom, I realized there was nothing that I could use as a weapon, and by the time I did, the other Marielle had started her charge at me again, and I screamed, barely managing to slip past her and throw myself onto the bed. I reached for the pillow and through horrified, panicked inhales and exhales, I threw it at her, which as you may imagine was not a very effective weapon, and I crawled back, gasping as I fell over at the other side. Standing up as fast as I could, I was met with the awful sight of her crawling onto the bed like a spider. But that was not what disturbed me the most. Her head, mouth still hanging open so painfully and eyes empty like a dark abyss. Her head was throwing itself into impossible angles just like that thing pretending to be Connor had been doing while I was hiding. I tried to make my way to the other corner of the room, but she pounced on me, pinning me to the ground with inhuman strength, and she gripped my neck and lifted me up, slamming me into the wall. And as I looked into her, parts of her skin started going black. While I was still running, I heard the sound of glass shattering through the window. When the other Marielle had pinned me, I heard Connor shouting, and a chair suddenly hit my double and it released its grip on me. That moment allowed me to look into the kitchen and see Connor being attacked by his double and disappearing out of sight. And Rebecca was held against the wall by another creature in the skin of a police officer, but her hand was raised and she was holding her glass shard still. All she had to do was drive it into its head and she would have freed herself. But the thing was too fast and it stopped her arm mid-air with its own, squeezing so hard it caused her to drop the shard and scream in pain. All of this happening in less than a second, and then it dropped her arm and put its palm against her mouth. What I witnessed after that was the total disappearance of that thing's everything. It was just a totally black silhouette that resembled a human, with impossibly uneven proportions, constantly swapping, but the only thing that stayed consistent was the arm with which it held onto Rebecca's mouth. Its palm then moved from just covering her mouth to grabbing her entire head, and she let out a guttural scream that only got louder and louder as it tightened its grip. I couldn't see anything more as I still had the other me to deal with. While looking into the kitchen, an idea came to me. I could lure this Marielle towards the window and use its pieces of glass to shatter her. And that's what I did. I sprinted as fast as I could to the window and turned back to see that she was already running for me. Her hands were out trying to grab me and I ducked right before she was able to and moved to the right, causing her to ram in front of the window and into its frames. It was now or never. I turned around and gathered all the strength that I had left to grab the other Marielle's head and slam it into the sharp piece of glass pointing right up. She was able to release one final shriek before it pierced into her left eye and she stood there frozen and silent. At that moment, I looked up to see what was happening inside the kitchen, and I saw that Rebecca had completely disappeared, while Connor was still in a tussle with his double. I was about to crawl through the window back to help before I was forced down on the floor by an awful throbbing pain in my ankle, hand, and now neck, where the other Marielle had held me up. But the pain was soon to disappear, and I looked back up towards the window where my double was beginning to crack. And I called out for Connor one last time before she turned to pieces, and my memories end there. What I remember immediately after was waking up in a hospital bed with an IV going into my left hand, and I was covered by a sheet. I was so exhausted that I could barely produce any sound that alerted a visitor I didn't know I had sitting on a chair by the bed. "Easy, Marielle." The voice was that of a woman, and it would certainly have made me scream if I had the strength for it. "You've been out the longest out of us three." I slowly turned my head to see Rebecca smiling at me, with this expression that had something off about it, but I choked it up to condition. "Rebecca, what happened?" "We did what we had to do is what happened, but you were completely out of it when we came out." I was too worried about Connor to ask what she had meant by "came out." I was definitely in need of a memory refresher. "Where's Connor? Is he okay?" "Oh yes, honey, don't worry about him. He's in the neighboring room. You two had a real struggle in there." She then stood up, and at that moment, I could not remember how she had suddenly disappeared while we were in that place. She made her way to the door and opened it, stepping out. "You'll have to ask the nurses if you can see him though." "Wait, Rebecca," I called out weakly. Is it over?" "I'll tell you later, Marielle. Visiting time is over and I need to feed Toby, you know. He's probably starving by now. You know how much Frenchies eat." Before I could question her more, she shut the door and I was left alone. For the first time, completely alone and separated from Connor since he had offered me his help. I was afraid for him and I wanted to see him, but at least I had Rebecca's word that he was okay. I moved the covers to look at my hand and ankle. The parts where I had been marked were covered in bandages, and I had no idea what was under there. And when I ran my other hand over the front of my neck, I confirmed that the case was the same with it too. I was sure that if they had remained like that, I had a lot of explaining to do, and I wasn't sure how I was going to go about it, but I had the chance to finally rest and I wasn't about to say no to it. Not long after, a male nurse entered my room with a tray of food and smiled under his mask. "Hello, miss. I was told that you were awake. You were in quite the condition when we got to you. It was a stroke of luck your neighbors saw you before you had lost too much blood." "Blood? What happened to me?" I recalled the black marks again and ran my hand over the bandages on my neck. "You had some really deep wounds where the bandages are, and your neighbor's son saw you passed out on the driveway bleeding. Poor kid, but he saved your life." "Is Connor here? Can I see him? He was with me." The nurse looked at me confused and scratched his head. "Ma'am, there is nobody else with you, and we don't have a patient by that name in the ward." I raised my eyebrows and felt myself begin to tense. "That's impossible. He was with me. Check again, please. I was with two other people, that lady and Connor. Please, check again." "Okay, ma'am, okay. Don't stress yourself out, please. You really need to rest and keep yourself steady. I'll be back in a few moments." He smiled and nodded at me before turning around and leaving the room, but I was too nervous for pleasantries right now. I started to wonder why Rebecca was in such a rush and why she would lie about Connor if he wasn't here. I had remembered by now how she suddenly went missing while I was still inside that place, but I thought that just like how I had returned to the real world after I had killed the other me, the same thing must have happened to her. But there wasn't another her, right? That's when I replayed our conversation over a few times in my head before she left, and I kept stopping at one detail in particular. Was I misremembering it? Or did she get the name of her dog wrong? Damon McCory, Rain, Big Country Allen, Meat Gasher, Smiling Cat, Jerry Ramey, Die Screaming, Nelson Asada,